the civil rights movement in the United States. That's what I'd like to talk about in today's history video. Right after the Civil War, after Appomattox, blacks had civil rights in the South. They could vote, they could hold office. There was a black senator, U.S. senator from Mississippi. A lot of whites couldn't vote because they had been in rebellion against the U.S. and refused to take the loyalty oath. Then in 1876, Grant left office. He had been the protector of civil rights. And Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, took office in a tie election. And the condition of his becoming president was that he'd withdraw troops from the South. The Democrats insisted on that. And the result was that from 1877 on, the Jim Crow laws took effect and dominated society in the South. The Ku Klux Klan was really the first terrorist organization. It was absolutely as ruthless as Al-Qaeda. The casualty toll was very similar, 3,000 or 4,000 blacks killed in lynchings and other acts of terrorism. But it was sanctioned by the state governments, the state police, the local police forces, and even though Republicans were in the White House, who for the most part were pro-civil rights, they didn't do anything to stop them because the states had that level of jurisdiction and could control that. When the 14th Amendment was passed that banned discrimination, it says it shall be enforced by Congress. That's because at that time they didn't trust Johnson, the president, to enforce it, Andrew Johnson. But afterwards it backfired because the Southerners took control of Congress and you couldn't have any federal enforcement action. The things continued more or less in stasis until 1954, when the Supreme Court shattered the status quo with the Brown v. Board of Ed decision, a unanimous decision brought by Republican Chief Justice Earl Warren. And it banned segregation in the schools and ordered that they be integrated, quote, with all deliberate speed. Well, speed proved to be the one thing that didn't happen. But in 1957, the courts forced the integration of public schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, Central High School. This was a key event in President Clinton's early life. And 9 black children were sent to integrate Central High School in Little Rock. And the crowd kept them out. The state troopers came out and forced them, closed them, and stopped them from going into the school. And Eisenhower had to call out the 82nd Airborne Division, which with 30,000 troops with bayonets affixed, ushered the children into the school and stopped the mobs outside. That kindled and sparked an entire effort for the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King. In 1956, the Alabama NAACP passed a resolution demanding that buses be integrated. And Rosa Parks, who was the chairman of the Alabama Birmingham NAA, got on a bus and refused to sit in the back. At that time, blacks had to sit there. She was arrested, tried, convicted, and I believe went to jail for a year. That sparked the Birmingham bus boycott. Excuse me, it wasn't Birmingham, it was Montgomery, Alabama. And nobody in the town would take any buses. And since 90% of the ridership was black, it meant that the bus line was not in the black, it was in the red. And the town caved in and buses were integrated. The next stage in the movement was the sit-ins, where largely northern civil rights activists, white and black, went to southern cities and sat in at lunch counters. At the time, department stores, like a store called Woolworth's, the old department store, would have lunch counters, and that's where most people had their lunch. And they were segregated. And these sit-ins would occupy stools in the lunch counter, very politely ask for service. They would be refused, and they wouldn't move. And the police had to come in and drag them away and arrest them. And then more people took the turn, and more people took the turn. They were beaten savagely, and it was a very ugly situation, but it made the point that public accommodations were segregated and that they shouldn't be. Then the sit-ins got wheels. They were called Freedom Riders. In 1960, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to segregate facilities adjacent to interstate highways, like rest stops and stuff. And the Freedom Riders would board Greyhound buses that would go to the South and they would demand service at the rest stops. They'd be refused, they'd be jailed, they'd be beaten. Some, I believe, were even killed. And the Freedom Rides again demonstrated the importance of desegregation of intrastate communications and transportation, which fell under federal jurisdiction. In 1963, the civil rights movement turned a corner, 62 and 63, and moved into Birmingham, Alabama, in a series of protests. These protests sparked the church bombing in Birmingham, where 3 young black girls were killed, and it led to the imprisonment of Martin Luther King, who wrote the very famous Letter from the Birmingham Jail that is one of the amazing documents of world history, where he lays out the case for nonviolence. But Birmingham was anything but nonviolent. The police chief, Bull Connor, deployed fire hoses and police dogs against the demonstrators, and it was a fierce situation. Finally, the federal government had to send in troops to stop the violence and to stop the massacres that were going on. Not massacres and killing, but in beatings and arrests and all of that stuff. That precipitated the introduction of the Civil Rights Bill by John Kennedy. President Kennedy had been very aloof from the civil rights movement. In fact, when he was in the Senate, he often voted with the Southern segregationists against the Republicans who were pressing civil rights measures. But as he became president, his consciousness was raised more and more. An important event in his election campaign was when he called King's widow, Anne King, who was imprisoned in jail during his campaign for a nonviolent protest, and that helped Kennedy win a lot of black votes, and in a very close election was very important. Robert Kennedy, his brother, who served as Attorney General, also went through a consciousness raising where more and more civil rights became an important thing to them. And because of the outrageous tactics in Birmingham and the Freedom Riders and the lunch counter sit-ins, the nation's public swang overwhelmingly against the racist laws in the South. And there was a huge outpouring of sympathy, empathy, and support from churches and from civic groups throughout the North for the civil rights movement. That led President Kennedy to introduce the first sweeping civil rights bill that banned discrimination in public accommodations. And it was a huge deal. The South fought it tenaciously with filibusters. Kennedy was assassinated before he could see it through, and I'm not sure he would have been able to get it passed. And Lyndon Johnson from Texas, who had a record of supporting segregation, took office as president. But he flipped, and he became a strong advocate of civil rights and got the Civil Rights Bill passed through his knowledge of the Senate rules and of tactics, and a very aggressive effort. In the course of that, there was a March on Washington in 1963, when millions of people literally thronged the area in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and Martin Luther King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. That was followed by a meeting at the White House, not millions, it was about 250,000 people, and it generated the support for the Civil Rights Bill, which passed in 64. Then in 65, the movement had its ultimate confrontation in Selma, Alabama, where there was a march through Selma to demand voting rights. And the police chief there was fierce and vicious. The scenes of police dogs and policemen beating demonstrators and tear gas and fire hoses on young children galvanized the country as never before. And in 1965, Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act, which was the absolute key element, because it provided that essentially voter registration would be taken out of the hands of the South and given to the federal government. And the result was blacks could get the right to vote, and from then on they were able to desegregate Southern society and to take their place in it. Thanks for watching. I'm sorry, Eileen's just corrected me. Rosa Parks did not serve a jail term. She was arrested and released the same day, but she remains really the mother of the civil rights movement. Incidentally, we have a book that Eileen and I wrote and Clayton Leota illustrated called Dubs Goes to Washington, and then another one, Dubs Goes to Philadelphia. And in both of them, our dog, Dubs, our golden retriever, visits the important memorials in American history. And one is his visit to the Lincoln Memorial. And he talks about all men are free and equal, and can it possibly be that dogs are too, especially me? And it's a very cute book. It's something that really can teach your children values. And you can get it at dickmorris.com or amazon.com. Dubs goes to Philadelphia, and Dubs goes to Washington. Thanks for watching.